With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right. Even if the whole world is telling you to move. It is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say no. You move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Tactics. Thank you so much for being with us here in the Situation Room, where speech isn't violence, tolerance isn't love, and disagreement isn't hate. We certainly do appreciate you being with us this afternoon because, of course, it is a very, very big day for the state of Alabama because Super Tuesday is tomorrow. That's right, Super Tuesday is tomorrow. Go to your polling places, make sure that you vote, make sure that everything's in order. And we're going to be going over the ballot. We do this every election, every primary. One of the things that we do on the show is we literally take a sample ballot. I have a sample ballot right here. Now, I think this may be the first time I've actually been able to show the sample ballot because every other time I've done it, I have the ballot, but all I can do is do this next to the microphone. I can't actually show people because, you know, I've always been on the radio. But anyway, so we do have the sample ballot here, and we're going to go over this just like we do with every election. There's a lot on this that I do think is important, but before we get into it, one quick housekeeping thing. Because tomorrow is Super Tuesday, and because it is a very big day, not only for the national news media looking at how the Democrats did in their primaries and that kind of thing, that's going to be part of it, don't get me wrong. But we're also going to be doing a special tomorrow. I'm going to try to do a live stream that actually goes with the results. So show's probably not going to start at 6 o'clock tomorrow. I'll probably put off and do a live stream like I did with the State of the Union that starts probably about 8, 9. I don't know exactly when I'll be able to start because my other job is also very hectic right now. The Faulkner lectureships are going on, which some absolutely fantastic speakers are coming in from out of town to do that. So if you've got some free time during the day or at night, come by Faulkner's campus and listen to those. I highly, highly recommend it. I've been doing that practically all day, and so it kind of worked out very well for me that the sample ballot is going to be the majority of our show today, and I've been really kind of prepping for this show for the past 6 months, so I feel like I didn't have to do a ton of my own research today because, you know, just like most voters, I had a pretty good idea of who I was going to vote for going into this, but as is tradition, I never reveal exactly who I'm voting for until the day of. So we're going to do this, and we're actually going to do something that is a little bit different than I normally do it. We are going to go down the sample ballot, but we're actually going to start at the bottom. Now, I know I never do this. I know it's always we start at the top of the ballot, we work our way down. But the reason that I'm doing this is because I think actually what is at the bottom of this particular ballot is so incredibly important that it supersedes the importance of every other race. I'm including the Senate primaries. I'm including the Republican House primaries. In my case, that's District 2, of course. I really do think that the Amendment 1 question is the most important thing on this ballot. And because of that, I'm trying to emphasize to you its importance by going first on it. And there's several things that have been said about it. We've talked about it a lot on the program. Vicki Garrettson has talked about it a lot on the program. We've had different people call in and discuss some of its merits and more often its demerits. But ultimately, this is what it boils down to. The people of Alabama have to decide. And what this bill does is twofold. It, A, moves our board from an elected board, which we currently have. We elect our state school board members to an appointed board that would be appointed by Governor Ivey and whoever her predecessors may be from then on. So at that point, they will no longer be elected officials. They will be elected appointed officials by the governor. So we would vote for them in a very indirect way in the sense that we choose our governor and we choose our senators who have oversight over them. But ultimately, we would not do a direct election of them the way that we do now. And I think that that's a problem, but I'll explain some of both sides of that. The second thing that it does is it would enshrine Common Core as the national standard. Well, I mean, it is already the national standard. It would enshrine a national standard. Right now, that national standard is Common Core as Alabama's education policy in perpetuity. So, in other words, unless we actually amend the Constitution again a second time, it will actually be a part of Alabama's Constitution that we must follow national standards and guidelines. And by the way, the only show in town right now is Common Core. We'll get into that in a second, but first I want to get into the first one, which is appointed boards versus elected boards. So there's several moving parts to this argument, but frankly, I'm going to be honest. I think that there are good arguments to be made for both approaches. I think that you can make a compelling argument for why the school board ought to be appointed by a governor as opposed to elected by individuals in the state. But that's all theoretical. I understand the arguments. I understand that there are certain things, cabinet members, certain appointments that I have no problem with installing those people by fiat via the person that we elect to be the governor. The reason that I oppose it is because in the state of Alabama, that's a really, really bad place for that to be the one that you try this out in. And the reason that I say that is, guys, I love my state. One of the big reasons that I do this show is because I do love the state of Alabama. I do care about what goes on within its border. I do care about Alabama politics, and that's one of the reasons that I do this thing every day. And I think that it's the best state in the country to live in, and I mean that sincerely. Unfortunately, I think that this is a really bad state to try that in because Alabama has a really bad track record of picking crappy governors. We do. Alabama's got a lot going for it. We got a lot of natural resources. I love the people here. We're a part of the Bible Belt. I mean, there is no end of good things that you could say about Alabama, but let's be honest, when it comes to our political scene, we have a habit of picking really awful governors. I mean, when you look at Bob Riley, who has been brought up on charges of corruption, Don Siegelman, who actually just recently got out of prison because of his corruption as the top official in the state of Alabama. You look at Governor Bentley, who had to resign in shame. We've got a bad track record of picking governors that do not have integrity and are really prone to doing what, unfortunately, a lot of Alabama politics is based on, having a good old boys club where they elect their buddies to cushy appointments. I fear that that's what's going to happen here, because when you look at Governor Bentley, for example, who had his mistress in his employ and had her husband with a cushy six-figure state job that they literally invented for him, and then tried to get the attorney general to quit poking into his affair and his scandal by, just appointing him a senator, you start to understand why maybe having the governor appoint our board is maybe not such a great idea. Because if we do get saddled with a corrupt governor, which unfortunately for whatever reason Alabama seems to have a habit of doing, then you don't want that guy picking who your school board members are, because at the very best you're going to get incompetence, and at the very worst, in a far more likely scenario, what you're going to wind up with is cronyism. And the guy just picking his buddies or using these jobs as kickbacks for a political favor. And by the way, that would be even more true because of the second thing that it does, because it basically in a lot of ways puts Alabama's education system on autopilot. I'm not saying completely, but a lot of the stuff is automatically going to be done according to Common Core standards because of the new standards that are put into place. And so what you're doing is you're simultaneously, with the same bill, saying we're going to go ahead and set our education standards by this, which means regardless of how the board is elected, they will have less to do. And you're also saying, and by the way, we're also going to get rid of our elected school board members, so instead we're just going to have political appointees by the governor. Well, don't you see how that makes it ripe for corruption even more so? Because you can just put somebody in there as basically a figurehead, and the state runs itself because it runs off of Common Core now. It doesn't take a genius to see how this could basically make the positions political kickbacks for people that help to get a governor elected. I mean, it's obvious that that's a potential danger with this. Now, when it comes to the reason that we should have appointed boards instead of elected, there's several stupid arguments that I've heard. And like I said, there are some decent arguments. There are some good arguments. But I'm going to go over some of the stupid ones because I've already talked about some of the positive ones, one of which being, when it comes to it, I can see them being, less prone to some of the whims of the populace, which sometimes can lead you in a bad direction. There's a reason that we're a republic. There's a reason that we value the rule of law. I tend to think that when it comes to a school board, that should be somebody that's a little more accountable to the needs of the populace and that kind of thing. And I agree that the average parent isn't that well versed in what's going on in their kids' schools, and that's really more the fault of the electorate than the elected officials. And I understand that argument, but there have been several dumb arguments that have also been made, and these are just a couple of them. First of all, and I've already explained it to some degree why this one's bad, we need to get politicians out of the Board of Education. Guys, that one's just laughable. I've seen actually one of the ads that is saying to vote yes for this particular bill, saying we have to get the politicians out of the Board of Education. How are political appointees not politicians? Can anybody explain that to me? Can you point to a political appointee that is appointed by the governor that is not a politician? And by politician, I'm not saying that somebody that has run for office before, even though that would very often be the case as well. I'm talking about people that tried to and vied for that job by seeking the favor of the governor. Now, they're seeking the favor of the governor as opposed to seeking the favor of the people of Alabama, but ultimately it's still a political job. When you refer to something as office politics, that's essentially what you're talking about, right? Somebody that's trying to climb the ladder. Politics are going to be involved in this as well. And like I said, it also would be very likely that what you're going to see is quite a bit of cronyism. But even if the cronyism were gone, even if everything was on the up and up, the governor picked fantastic board members and all of that, you can't say that they're not politicians. They were hedging their bets and voting on a governor candidate and trying to help them get elected in hopes of getting an appointment, maybe. And they would definitely have to vie against other people and try to convince the governor that they would be best for the job. That would make you a politician. I'm sorry. You would be a political appointee instead of elected, but you're still a politician. It's just a dumb argument. Another one, that this actually comes via Matthew Stokes from Yellowhammer News. I believe he's a guest contributor. I don't think that he's a permanent contributor, but double check me on that. He was saying that we should be voting yes for this, and this was his argument. That is because the current process creates negative incentives for board members because they hold their office at the behest of voters. There is every incentive for them to avoid upsetting their constituents. Yeah, that's kind of the point. It's hilarious to me that Stokes uses this as a reason that we should move to appointed board members. He's saying it's a bad thing that the board members have to worry about upsetting the voters. Well, yeah, that's kind of why we have the elected process for them or any other elected official, is because we want them to be scared of upsetting the voters. That's the point. And that's the reason that we have elections to follow up after that election, is so if they do something to tick off the electorate, they do something to tick off the people that elected them, they say, nope, you're done. You're gone. You're out. That's why we have elections. Kind of a dumb argument to make. The second one that he makes here, this is in that same article by Stokes. The current system is of a worse nature, however, as it leaves the governor and Senate almost powerless to impact education policy. Okay, that one's not nearly as dumb as the first one, but I kind of see that as a good thing. To be honest, I don't really want the Senate and the governor impacting education policy all that much. They do have some impact over it, primarily budgetary. But I don't really like the idea of the Senate or the governor having too much impact on education. I would rather the board do that. And I would rather the board do that because they are an elected body of officials that are meant to oversee that, for the same reason that I don't want the governor having too much power, the Senate having too much power over what the Commissioner of Agriculture's office does, or any of the other constitutional officers. They're specialists in their field, or at least are supposed to be, ideally, and that's the reason that we elect them to those specific positions. the school board members are no different. We need people that are good and knowledgeable when it comes to an education system and how it works. But the reason ultimately that we do that is because we're the ones that elect them and we want them to enact the policies that we see fit. Having a middleman in the form of the governor and the Senate, that seems to be, it seems like it would cause more problems that would fix. Again, I'm not saying that there's no merit to that argument. I'm not saying that it's completely stupid. It's actually a lot better than his earlier argument that we just discussed. But I don't think that you can go ahead and assume that the governor and the Senate having very little impact on the education in the state is necessarily a bad thing. In fact, that's one of the things that I like about the current system, is that the governor and the senators, which are not experts in education, and that's the reason that we have these experts to oversee that policy, the fact that they are not there and they do not have a lot of oversight over it is kind of a good thing. But anyway, AL.com also tried to make the case that, well, the reason that we need to change is because it's putting us at odds with other states surrounding us. Okay, there's a couple of problems with that. First of all, they changed their headline. Because this article, which, by the way, I posted on my Facebook feed, if you're one of my friends on Facebook, you're following Tactics Radio, which you can do, facebook.com/Tactics Radio, that story is up there. And when I first posted it, AL.com had a headline that was very much leading, basically suggesting that the reason that we need to vote for Amendment 1 is because we're different than all the other states and we need to be just like all the other states. Well, first of all, that's a dumb argument, because it's the, if your mother, the same argument that your mother would apply to you, well, if everybody jumped off a bridge, would you do it too? Just because other people are doing it does not make it a good idea. I mean, just a little common sense wisdom from your mom debunks that you could understand when you were 5 or 6 years old. So just because other states are doing it and the majority of states have appointed school board members does not mean that it's necessarily a good idea. And I think that AL.com realized that, and that's the reason that they changed their headline. And by the way, the information in the article is not bad. Like, I actually found it pretty insightful. It's just the fact that they were originally trying to lead you in a certain direction when it came to this, and they did correct themselves, and I give them credit for that. But one of the pieces of evidence that they tried to use to convince people to move to a appointed board as opposed to an elected board was this graphic that they used that shows how different states select their board members. And you will notice that there is an awful lot of green. The vast majority of their states do have appointed school board members at the state level. And very few states, Alabama included, and the other states there in blue, have voters elected. So you'll look at that. That's Texas, Kansas, Colorado, Utah, Michigan. You'll notice that there are a few other states that also have elected board members. Now, here's the funny thing about this. And originally, like I said, this article was trying to lead the voter into voting yes and making the case that we need to vote yes for it because it puts us at odds with the other states surrounding us, and the majority of states have appointed board members, which again is a bad argument, but their map actually kind of makes the opposite case of that, because if you look at the states that were there in blue, you will notice that Utah, Colorado, and Kansas all have elected board members, and they are consistently in the top 15, for sure in the top 20, but usually in the top 15 of different studies and surveys trying to understand which states are best when it comes to education. I looked at about 3 or 4 of them, and those 3 states, Colorado, Utah, and Kansas, are consistently in the top 15. There were a couple that didn't include 1 or 2 of them in the top 15, but the overwhelming majority, the average, would say that they're in the top 15 states. And they have elected board members just like we do. You'll also notice that in those same surveys, that a lot of the other states that were at the top were green. And then you reverse that and look at some of the states that were in green, in other words, the states that have appointed board members: Tennessee, Kentucky, South Carolina, Arkansas, Mississippi, all states that are near us. Those states are consistently in the bottom 15 in these different surveys. And so, based on this, it seems as though how a state has a board, whether it's appointed or elected, no matter how they decide who their board members are going to be, has no measurable effect on the effectiveness of their school system. And so I think that you couldn't look at that map and say, see, we need to have elected officials because the elected official states are doing really well. Well, yeah, some of them are, but Alabama's consistently at the bottom, and we have elected members, and Michigan's not doing too great either, and it has elected members. And so Texas is about middle of the pack most of the time. So it's just kind of, I think it's a little below average, but not much. And so you can look at that and say, well, it seems as though how they select their board members doesn't really have a discernible effect on that. I'm not saying that it doesn't have an effect at all. I'm just saying that at least based on statistically, those two approaches don't seem to at least immediately necessitate that a state does better or worse in education. It seems to be a lot of other factors playing into that make a big difference. But the more important side of that, I think the infinitely more important side of this is that this bill, if enacted, enshrines Common Core indefinitely as a part of Alabama's education system. Because it's a bait and switch. What they will do is they will tell you, and this case has been made no telling how many times through different advertisements, different surrogates that are promoting this bill, that no, this gets rid of Common Core. Well, yes, in some sense it does. And by that I mean it says that Common Core is no longer the standard. The standard is going to be whatever the national standard is. And then you ask, oh, what's the national standard? Oh, it's Common Core. So it takes officially Common Core out, but it's still going to be the only option that we have when we comply with a national standard, which is what this bill calls for. It would be like, and I gave this analogy Friday when I was discussing this with Becky, it would be like I said, you know what, the state should not be using Apple products. Apple products suck, they're not efficient, they're too expensive, whatever. By the way, I'm not trying to bash Apple specifically, even though I happen to be a PC guy. I'm just using this example. And you said, you know what, we just need to make it to where Alabama doesn't buy any more Apple products. And then I put in the bill, instead of buying Apple products for the state, what we're going to do is we're just going to buy all of our technology at the Mac store. You do realize the only things at the Mac store are Apple products, right? That's what we're doing here, is we're saying that no more Common Core. We're just going to select our education policy from the national standards, which, by the way, is Common Core. It's a bait and switch. It actually reminds me of this old Christmas cartoon that I used to watch when I was a little kid. And there was this little old woman who lived in a shoe. It's based off that nursery rhyme, and the woman is feeding her baby in this particular cartoon, and it's one of those goofy old Tex Avery cartoons. And the baby refuses to eat, and she holds up the spoon, and it has what looks like spinach in it. I think it's spinach. And the baby's just sitting there like, nope, not going to eat it. And then the mom reaches down and picks up a bowl of something. I think it's ice cream. I think it's supposed to be ice cream. It's hard to tell in some of those old animations where the quality is not great. But then she picks up the ice cream and the baby's like, ooh, raises his mouth open, closes his eyes like, and then what the mom does is sticks the spinach in there. So she used the ice cream to get him to open his mouth and then jabs the spinach in there, and then he bites it and he doesn't like it. And then, because it's a baby in this cartoon, it's mad at her, but then she holds up the ice cream again, opens mouth wide, spinach goes in, and she does this 2 or 3 times. That's what's going on here. The people in the state of Alabama that want this thing to pass are promising you that they're going to get rid of Common Core while installing Common Core and enshrining it as a part of Alabama's Constitution. So not only would it be part of our education policy, which would be kind of a lateral movement, it makes it even harder to get rid of. They're pulling out that spinach on you at the last second. They're promising you ice cream, showing it to you, saying, see, you can have this, and then the second that you close your eyes and open your mouth, in goes the spinach. That's what is happening here. There are several bad arguments in favor of this one as well. One of the worst ones that I saw was this only mandates that we have national standards. So we would have to have Common Core compliant standards, but that wouldn't affect the teaching practices. For example, when teachers teach kids that you have to have 35 steps to do long division. Some of the crazy examples of Common Core that we've seen recently, they're saying, you see, those things aren't mandated. It only mandates the national standards. Well, here's the thing. First of all, a national standard isn't necessary or good in the first place. We have not had a national standard since really up until Common Core. And we've always done just fine. The country has always done okay. In fact, it did far better when there were no national standards or no National Board of Education at all. Back before we had a Department of Education at the federal level, America was the undisputed number one when it came to education. It was only since the 1970s, when that was implemented, that the federal government started getting its greasy little hands involved in the state education systems, that things started to go south. And so forgive me if I don't have a lot of confidence in a national standard. The country functioned very well for a very long time before we even had a national Department of Education, much less a nationwide education standard to say, no, everybody that graduates from high school has to be able to do this, or this is the standard they have to meet. The states can decide that for themselves. We can decide that for themselves. We understand what is best for our kids. And there's no reason that we should bow down to the federal government and let them do all of that. And another thing, too, if you have to meet the standards, in other words, you have to know all the information that is contained within these national standards known as Common Core, wouldn't that pretty much necessitate the teaching methods? I mean, of course, there would be some wiggle room. But ultimately, to know what is on that test, if you adopt a national test, well, then you have to be compliant with said test. This is one of the big issues that teachers have been complaining about for decades, is that they're having to teach to the test as opposed to teaching the way that they want to. And they have to teach you certain things and teach you a certain way to do it, otherwise you won't be able to pass the test. This is one of the big issues that a lot of teachers have with standardized tests in general, and I'm talking about more generically the SATs or the ACT. So, the idea that, oh, well, we can have the national standards without implementing the teaching practices, you really can't. That's something that can't be separated out, at least not in an effective way. And another thing, too, this bill actually would enshrine those teaching methods as a part of the state curriculum. I've seen the bill. I've seen the teaching standards. And a lot of the teaching standards that they are using, they have been trying to sell people, do the same thing that they're doing with this bill, a bait and switch. Saying, no, we got rid of Common Core, and then you'll look, and they literally just switched the words around, or switched the wording of the sentence, or changed a couple of words in it, but all the content is still there word for word. Or at least thought for thought. Some of the words, like I said, they may have changed, or they may have changed a heading, or moved where this particular standard is, but it's still Common Core. And what this bill would do is that would make that a part of our Constitution. This is a horrifically bad idea. And since education has only gotten worse since the federal government got involved, you can readily see why this would have quite a bit of pitfalls. Now, the other argument that I've heard is that Common Core isn't bad. Well, here's the thing. We have just recently reached the 4-year implementation mark. In other words, it has been 4 years since Common Core was implemented, which meant the kids that were in ninth grade when it started out, when we started using Common Core, they are now graduating and getting ready for college. So there have been we've been able to do pretty conclusive studies on this, because there have been kids that had a full 4-year high school education based off of the standards in Common Core. And do you know what we found? Alabama's ACT scores had been going up before the implementation of Common Core. And since their implementation, they have been going down. In fact, the past 2 years, we have seen ACT scores across the board go down. We were on an upward trajectory. Now we're on a downward one since we implemented Common Core. And it's also important to note that our college prep, in other words, how ready students are for college, that rating has also gone down and had been going in an upward position. Now they're not as prepared as they were. Alabama has its flaws, and when it comes to their education system, there's a lot we need to do to fix it. Don't get me wrong. But we were headed in the right direction. Then we implemented Common Core, and we started heading back in the wrong direction. It's abundantly clear to me that we need to abandon this practice because it is not working for the kids in the state of Alabama. But when it's all said and done, ultimately what this bill does, Amendment 1, is it represents two massive shifts of power. One, away from the voters and into the state senate and the governor of Alabama, in the sense that we no longer get to vote for our board members. They get to decide who we will have. They get to mandate to us who is going to be on our school board. Regardless of whether you think it's a good idea or a bad idea, it is, by definition, a shift of power from the people of Alabama to Governor Ivey's office and the state senate. And the second shift of power is away from the state of Alabama to the federal government. Now we're saying the Fed gets to mandate what our standards are going to be when it comes to education. And so if you want to keep power local, you want to retain your own power, you want the people of Alabama to be empowered to make their own decisions when it comes to the education of our kids, you have to vote no on this bill. Because both of the measures contained within this bill move power away from you and away from the people of Alabama. We're going to take a quick break. We'll get back to our ballot and go over some of our races. We'll go over those quickly, and we'll be back in just a minute here on Tactics.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now it's time for a reading from the SJW Bible, the only Bible read by Pete Buttigieg. Today's reading is going to come from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 30 through 38. And it says, Jesus replied and said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, who were probably only stealing because the capitalist system had trapped them in a life of poverty. And they stripped him and beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. And by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Likewise a Levite also, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, who was on a journey, came upon him. And when he saw him, he felt socially conscious outrage, and came to him and went on a passionate social media rant about how wrong it was that the priest and the Levite had ignored him, and how it proves that traditional organized religion doesn't work. When the man asked him for help, the Samaritan explained how the Jews had been systematically oppressing the Samaritans for centuries, and that he didn't need his help because of his Jew privilege. But despite this, the Samaritan assured him he would be the bigger man and contact his senator in Rome and start a new government program to help victims of roadside robberies and fund it by raising taxes on the 1%. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? And he said, the one who taught him to be woke and fought the system with redistribution of wealth instead of just helping that one guy. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same, comrade. Wow. So inspiring. This has been a reading from the SJW Bible. And remember, the only truth that matters is your truth. Hey everybody, welcome back. Thanks so much for being with us through the break. Now, I've got a couple of things that I do want to go over. We're really just going to have time to go over the sample ballot for today, and I think that that's going to have to be a wrap for us, but I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. Now, the first one is honestly the one that I had the most trouble with, because the vast majority of my audience is really not going to worry about the presidential race, because I'm going through a Republican ballot. I'm assuming that the vast majority of those that are listening to this program are probably Republicans, and so I'm just going to go over that one for the time being, because to be honest, I don't have time nor the desire to go over all of the Democrats, because I don't really want any of them. I can't really make a recommendation on any of the Democrat candidates that I can think of to vote in favor of, and so we're going to be going over the Republican ballot. Now, since Donald Trump is the incumbent, I'm not going to worry about that one, so the first one we're going to deal with is the United States Senate race. Now, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, this is the one that I had the most trouble with. This is the one that I thought about the most on who I was going to vote for in this primary. I like Stanley Adair. He seems like a super nice guy, has conservative principles. I had him on the show. You can go back and watch our interview with him if you want to at the Elmore County Candidates Forum. I mean, just absolutely nice guy. He's not a viable candidate. And maybe it would be better if he were, but regardless of what I wish were the case, Stanley Adair just doesn't have much of a chance to win. And then, of course, Bradley Byrne is directly after him because they do this thing alphabetically. I'll talk about Byrne in just a minute. I think that he is a real conservative. I think that he would be a pretty good senator. But there are some issues there, and I'll talk about that in a second. Arnold Mooney. Same problem as Stanley Adair. In fact, I think that he has a fantastic conservative record. He was endorsed by Mo Brooks. He's been pretty good at standing for conservative principles in the state, but he's not a viable candidate. There's virtually no chance that he has to win this thing, and because of that and because of what the polling says, I think that you have to kind of look over him because of that, and I hate that for Arnold Mooney. He seems like a super nice guy, but what are you going to do about that? I mean, the guy just doesn't have a chance of winning. And I certainly do not hold viability as the number one standard. I'll certainly vote for somebody even if I think they don't have a chance of winning, if I think that they're overall the best candidate. But in Mooney's case, I think there are better options out there that have a much better shot at winning. Ruth Page Nelson, I don't know nearly as much about her, but again, same issue, not really a viable candidate. Roy Moore. Now, I bear no animosity towards Roy Moore, and I don't believe for a second, and I went over this ad nauseum when the whole Roy Moore scandal was going on in the previous election, that there was a hint of truth to some of the rumors that he probably liked younger women and was chasing younger women in his 30s. But the idea that he actually sexually assaulted one or did something unseemly with them, there was never any evidence of that happening whatsoever that surfaced. So my decision on Roy Moore is not based upon that. I believe in innocent until proven guilty, and with that, they were never able to produce even a shred of conclusive evidence. It was always his word against hers, and there were some discrepancies in the stories, and some of the stories, the women even came out later and admitted, yeah, we just basically made it up. We basically just planted evidence. And so I don't believe any of that, but the thing about Roy Moore is a couple things. First of all, he seemed in the interviews that I've had with him, he's a really good judge and is woefully unprepared for the Senate. I remember in the last election that I asked him about, he couldn't even name another senator that he liked, somebody that he would want to emulate. He couldn't name, he seemed pretty ignorant of the Senate rules. He didn't have an opinion on several of the bills that were working their way through the Senate at the time. There were several times in that interview, and I had 2 or 3 with him, but this is true across the spectrum. I had them in all the interviews that I had with Judge Moore. The most common answer that I got from him is, I'll figure it out once I get up there. Well, I'm sorry, that's just not good enough. If you're going to try to convince me that you need to be the person that we want representing the state of Alabama in the Senate, and your answer to all these pressing questions that the Senate is dealing with is, I'll figure it out once I get there, I'm sorry, that shows that you're not a serious candidate. And when it comes to Judge Moore, he has shown a woeful lapse in judgment when it comes to picking people to surround himself with. This goes everywhere from racists like Steve Bannon, all the way to just having people that are awful at their jobs representing him on the national news outlets, that kind of thing. And I genuinely like Judge Moore. And I like some of the people that are surrounding him, friends of his, and I genuinely appreciate a lot of the things that he's done for the state of Alabama. I don't bear any animosity towards him whatsoever. I just think that he's not a great candidate. And I'm looking down this ballot, and I don't see a single name, and I'm including Arnold Mooney and Adair and Nelson. I don't see a single name that I think will not just absolutely destroy Doug Jones in the general election, except for Roy Moore. Now, I'm not saying Roy Moore will lose to Doug Jones. I'm saying he's the only candidate I'm looking at, and there's a question mark over my head. I'm not saying he will lose, and if pressed, I would say that he'll probably beat Doug Jones this time because it's a general and there's a presidential election going on. There's going to be higher voter turnout. It's not going to be a special election like last time. But he's the only one that it's even, I don't know, maybe he wins. Every other one, it's like, oh yeah, they definitely beat Doug Jones. Roy Moore, it's like, probably. And probably's good. But with literally any other candidate, it seems like a sure thing. And for that reason alone, I have to kind of say there's other better conservative options out there that are also far more likely to beat Doug Jones in the general. So I got to look the other way when it comes to Judge Moore. And then there is Tommy Tuberville. Tommy Tuberville has been largely empty. Much like the criticism that I just levied against Judge Moore, he seems woefully underprepared for the job. He seems to not really have a strong opinion on a lot of the issues. The only thing he does have a strong opinion on is, I really like Trump and I'm going to do whatever it takes to get his agenda through. Okay, well, that's a nice sentiment, I guess. But I want somebody that actually has their own ideas, that knows why they believe something. When it comes to Tuberville, and I genuinely like Tuberville, I'm an Auburn guy. I mean, he gave us 6 years in a row where we did not lose to Alabama, where we had bragging rights for 6 long years straight. So I'm definitely a Tuberville fan. I've got nothing against the guy. But as far as being a senator, I just don't see him being a good senator. I think that'll be okay, but there's a lot of unknowns that comes with that. It makes far more sense to pick somebody that has an actual track record and has an ideology and a reason at the core of their beliefs that they will stick to something, and has a voting record that we can back up. And so really what happens is we're left with 2 candidates, Bradley Byrne and Jeff Sessions. At least in my mind, those are the 2 that I'm really debating back and forth between. So this is what I came up with, because I did do as much research as I could on them and their voting records, because unlike a couple of the candidates on here, like Tommy Tuberville, they actually do have legislative voting records. And so it makes sense to compare those 2. So with Heritage Foundation, a conservative group, Bradley Byrne had a 98% Sessions score, which is, fantastic. But he only had a 75% lifetime score, which was very well below the average House Republican, which was 87. And that looked really odd and really suspicious to me. And so I looked into the voting records, and it turns out Bradley Byrne has been not voting on several important bills this session, and the only ones that he has been voting on are the ones that are slam dunks, which is why he has a 98% score. He's just been not voting on a lot of these bills. Which makes me suspect that what's going on is he actually is somebody that is more of a moderate. I wouldn't call him quite a rhino. I think that he actually is genuinely a conservative. I mean, he's not a Martha Roby, for example, who's just a Democrat in Republicans' clothing. When it comes to Bradley Byrne, I think that he has some conservative principles, but I think that he's been strategically avoiding certain votes to kind of bolster himself and make himself look more conservative than he actually is. And once he gets a Senate seat, he won't have to do that as much anymore. He can vote more the way that he was before he was running for the Senate, which will be a probably mediocre, about 75% of the time, usually votes the way that a conservative would want, kind of representative. Which is fine, but what if we had somebody that was better than that on their voting record? Same thing with Freedom Works. He only got a 70% lifetime score, so, just not impressive. So let's compare that to Jeff Sessions, who also has, and actually has a much longer track record because he's been in office much longer. Well, on his last session that he was in, the 116th Congress, Jeff Sessions had a 78% Sessions score, lower than Bradley Byrne's most recent one, but he had a higher lifetime score of 81%. And that's even more impressive because he was a senator, not a representative, and the average for a Republican senator is 56%. So whereas Bradley Byrne is below average on conservatism in the House, Jeff Sessions is significantly above average when it comes to conservatives in the Senate. And the difference is, Jeff Sessions voted on practically everything, as opposed to Bradley Byrne, who just recently has decided to strategically only vote on a handful of certain things and vote in things that he knows is going to get him in good graces with the conservatives. It seems to me like Bradley Byrne is a consummate politician. And he's trying to play this game to make himself look more conservative than he actually is. Jeff Sessions is the genuine article. And because of that, because I'll be honest, originally I was going into this expecting to vote for Bradley Byrne, if nothing else, just because Bradley Byrne's a younger guy and it would be nice to have some fresh blood. It'd be nice to have somebody that isn't Jeff Sessions going into it. But when you look at the data, you look at the numbers. If you want to vote for somebody that's going to have a proven track record of upholding conservative principles and voting that direction, you got to go with Jeff Sessions. And so that is who I will be voting for. Like I've said 100 times. I don't tell you who to vote for. I'm telling you who I'm voting for. Take that as you will. Maybe you think that, okay, a little bit less conservative, but having that youthful edge, maybe that puts Bradley Byrne, on top for that. Okay, if it does that for you, I don't think that Bradley Byrne is a terrible vote. If that's where you land on, okay, I get it. But I'm just saying that Jeff Sessions, at least based on the data, is going to be a more reliable conservative than Bradley Byrne is. When it comes to the 2nd district, and this is the one that is really important to me because I'm actually in the 2nd district. That's where my voting precinct is in Elmore County. This is the one that is being abdicated by Martha Roby. And it would be nice to have an actual conservative in there as opposed to a wolf in sheep's clothing known as Martha Roby. And when I look down this list, and it really bothers me that Jeff Coleman is currently leading this poll because, I mean, especially after the whole fiasco with defrauding millions of dollars out of military families that are moving, I don't see how anybody thinks of this guy as a viable candidate after news of that broke. And by the way, Kyle Whitmire did some fantastic work on that at AL.com. You can actually watch a video where he covers all of the details on that. So if you're curious about that, be sure to check that out. And that's a really good summary of the scandal. There's certainly more details, but that's a good little short, like 3 or 4 minute video to help you understand that. So I highly recommend watching that. And I think that ought to pretty much just, knock him out of it right away. Terry Hasdorf. Honestly, Terry Hasdorf, I think, is the best candidate in this race. I've spoken to her. She's a real conservative. She has she knows what she's doing. She has a track record. She doesn't have a voting record because she's never actually held office before. But she has a track record of certain legislation that she has supported in the past. And what's most important to me is she has an ideological core. You can tell when you talk to her that this isn't just something to get elected. She believes the stuff that she's talking about, and she knows her stuff. She has done her own homework. She knows what she believes and why she believes it. And because of that, I think she's actually the best candidate in this pool. Unfortunately, she has not taken off in the polls, and I wish that she had, because this would be an easy one for me if I were looking at this. This would be an easy vote for me if it were a close race between her and a few other people. No question, I go with Terry Hasdorf, and that's why I hope that she runs again. But the polls are just saying she doesn't have a chance. She's, I think, in the single digits if she even registers in most of the polls. And so, unfortunately, I don't think that she's going to win. Then you've got Troy King, which I have no time to go into the litany of horrible things that Troy King has done for this state. I mean, we literally had to craft most of our ethic laws off of crap that Troy King did and got away with because it was legal at the time. One of the slimiest, vilest characters in Alabama politics history. And yes, I'm including people like Governor Bentley in that. There is no question that I don't want Troy King nowhere near any kind of elected office. I wouldn't trust him to be a sheriff. I wouldn't trust him to be anything in the state of Alabama. And yet somehow this guy continues to run for stuff and continues to get at least decent polling. And I cannot for the life of me understand why, but there he is. And then you've got Jessica Taylor. I like Jessica Taylor. I genuinely do. She seems like a nice person. She also seems unwilling to talk to the media, which gives me a little pause, because remember, that's kind of how Martha Roby started out, and then it became no media contact, and then we haven't heard from her in, 8 years now? So that makes me pretty skeptical of her. And she's saying a lot of the right things, and I like a lot of her ads, but ultimately it's got to be deeper than that. And I don't like that the hallmark of her campaign is let's just be AOC, but for conservatives. It's not a bad place to start off, but she hasn't gotten really specific in any of her policy proposals, and that's one of the reasons I'm a little standoffish about her. So ultimately, I think that the best candidate in this race is Barry Moore. I would definitely pull the lever for Terry Hasdorf if I thought that she had a chance of winning, and I really hope that she runs for another office because I would love to vote for her at some point. But I don't think this is her race, and I wish that it were, but it's not. Barry Moore is an actual conservative. He has a fantastic voting record at the state level. You can tell that he also is somebody that knows what he's talking about. He's very knowledgeable about some of the issues. I've met him, and another thing that I really like about him is that he's an ag guy, and it also makes me very skeptical of the Farmers Federation, and I'm really worried about the Farmers Federation recently. They have made some very questionable political calls that they've endorsed Jeff Coleman, a guy that has no agricultural background whatsoever, over a guy like Barry Moore that has an ag degree and actually farms. What kind of crack is the Farmers Federation smoking that they made that decision? Because that makes no sense to me. And I am very wary of the direction the Farmers Federation is going because of that. And to be clear, I'm not saying necessarily that Jeff Coleman is a horrible person that should never be near elected office. I am saying that about Troy King. But I'm not saying that about Jeff Coleman, but the guy he's off-putting, he seems slick, he came out of nowhere, he has all this money for all this campaign ads, which seem to come out of thin air overnight. I mean, that's very sketchy to me. And I would be willing to bet that he's got some very generous donors that are going to be expecting some payback once he gets into office. So to me, the very clear choice, the person that is most likely to be a viable candidate, and on top of that, and more importantly, be a real conservative voice for the state of Alabama in Congress, is Barry Moore. That's who I'm voting for. Further down, Associate Justice of the Supreme Court, Cam Ward and Matt Friddy. Those would be the ones that I would vote for respectively. Cam Ward in place 1, and then Matt Friddy in place 2. By the way, it's Friday. Sorry, Matt Friday. It's like almost like Friday, but it's just a little bit faster. If you do want to check out his interview, you can also do that here on my channel. Let's see, what else? Oh, President of the Public Service Commission. Twinkle Anders Kavanaugh has been an absolute disaster when it comes to this. I mean, she's been in the pocket for utilities and the utility companies for a long time now. There is no question in my mind she does not need to be the president of the Public Service Commission. She's gotten way too chummy with the heads of the utilities and people like Alabama Power. And I don't hate Alabama Power or anything, but there's a certain point to where you're like, all right, I don't like the fact that they're a little too close, and there's been some questionable deals come out of the Twinkle Anders Kavanaugh administration. Robin Lineker is somebody that is passionate, and she wants to make the hallmark of the Public Service Commission transparency, which frankly it could use a really big dose of. This is another candidate that I've interviewed. I thoroughly encourage you to go and watch that interview with her. Let's see, what else? Okay, after that, it's mostly local elections, which we don't have time to get into. And I'll just go through these very quickly. Trump delegates, I think that Jim Ziegler would be an interesting one to send there, our state auditor. I would definitely recommend him. And then also another one that wants to be a Trump delegate is Tom Parker, who is our current Supreme Court Chief Justice in the Alabama Supreme Court. I think that it'd definitely be interesting to have him there. Another one that could be mentioned here, Arnold Mooney. You know, Arnold Mooney's a state representative here, and he's running for Senate. And also because I kind of feel bad because he's a real conservative that I don't think has a chance of winning the Senate, so I can't vote for him. I'm kind of voting for Arnold Mooney on the side there just because of that. What else? Cam Ward, I think that he would be a good delegate. Ben Harrison would be another one that I'm voting for. Bradley Cox. I don't think that's the Bradley Cox that I'm aware of, who's a former ag teacher, but I kind of want to vote for him, honestly, just to see if that's him. I'm going to call Brad and see if he's the one doing it. It wouldn't surprise me if he's the Trump delegate, but if it turns out that it really is him, I'm going to be voting for him. Let's see, who else? Charlotte Meadows. Charlotte Meadows, you may know, has been involved in education here in the state of Alabama for a very long time. Somebody that I recommend I recommend as a delegate. And then also a personal friend of mine, Jenna Boggs. So definitely vote for those if you get a chance. And remember, most importantly, vote no on Amendment 1. I would tell you to vote heck no on Amendment 1, but unfortunately they don't have a bubble for that. So you're just going to have to vote no. That's going to be our show for today. And we will be back tomorrow with live election coverage here on Tactics Radio with News Radio 1440. In the meantime, stay the course, friends. Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media or our business partners. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Video production by Jackson Dean. Broadcast studio provided by Faulkner University. Location studio provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2020.